Hi there, I'm Connor McCreary, and I'm here to talk to you about why originality is overrated, what author I just stole from, and tell you a little bit about one of my favorite characters from The Last Witch. So, as a creator, I get asked a lot about, like, where do you come up with your ideas? And, like a lot of creators, the answer is really, like, all over the place. But I specifically love to steal my ideas. Now, before you get all wound up and tell me that I'm a horrible person, it's fine because this guy says it's fine. Yep, that is world famous artist Pablo Picasso, who famously said that good artists borrow and great artists steal. And what I love about that quote is he actually stole it from somebody else. Yeah, this is T.S. Eliot. He's a British poet. And a couple of years before, he was quoted as saying, immature poets imitate and mature poets steal. What I think that Elliot and Picasso are really getting at, though, is the idea of your influences, right? Anybody who creates is influenced by other art. And, that's the difference they're talking about between this idea of imitating or borrowing and stealing. When you imitate or you borrow, it's still pretty clear what your source is, right? Everybody can talk about a movie or a TV show or a book where you're like, that's just kind of a bad version of this other thing I like. But when you steal, you make it totally your own. And so that's the difference between, say, something like The Magicians, which is hot Harry Potter University, or Harry Potter itself, which is actually a pretty close approximation of the comic book series, The Books of Magic. I mean, seriously, look at that. Look how close those protagonists are. Look at how there's an owl in the Books of Magic. They're actually very close. But that doesn't mean that Harry Potter is not a great storytelling world. Now, for The Last Witch, that influence, the biggest one, is probably Avatar: The Last Airbender. In fact, I like to pitch The Last Witch as Irish Avatar: The Last Airbender with just the right amount of child cannibalism. Because if you look at it, like Saoirse's quest to gain all these elemental magics is not so dissimilar from Aang, who starts as an airbender and eventually has to learn how to be an earth, a water, and a firebender as well, right? But Avatar isn't the only story that does stuff with elemental magics. There's tons more. You look at the Broken Earth trilogy, you could look at Naruto, you could look at Captain Planet, and so many more where characters either have an elemental magic, need to try to learn other elemental magics, their world is divided into the elements. It's a very, very common trope. But I didn't just steal the idea of elements. I actually stole a very specific character trait from one of the world's most famous authors to put in my book. And that is based on the character Nan, who's a big part of this first book. So I love the idea of a cigar smoking grandmother, right? There's something so transgressive about an old lady smoking a cigar. And so I took that idea. And when you look at Nan in my story, she is very much like an Obi-Wan type character. He is the person who's meant to teach Saoirse how to use all her magic. And as the story goes on, Nan goes from being sort of the wise person who knows everything to someone who gets more and more amazed and frightened by how much power her granddaughter has. And Nan, like many of these kind of tropes, she has a reason for why she could be a mentor character. She already knows something about magic through her time as a green witch, someone who can kind of use plants and plant magic. So now we're getting into, okay, well, where did you steal this from? I mean, some Obi-Wan, but if you're someone who's a big fan of witch literature, you probably could already tell me that I stole this from Roald Dahl, one of the greatest writers of all time, who had a cigar-smoking grandmother in his story. And I loved it. I thought it was great for all the reasons I've already explained. But as I was reading the story to my kids, I had started to have this idea about like what the cigar smoking meant. And this is why I think that what I'm doing is stealing and not borrowing. Because I'm not just borrowing a character trait. I actually stole the idea, and in my story, I'm using it in a completely different way. The fact that Nan smokes cigars is actually a huge plot point, especially in book 2. And so I think that's actually a really good way for people out there who are creating how you can start to steal instead of borrowing. A great idea is when you're reading a story and you think it's going to go one way, and then the author chooses to take it in another direction, is to look at the idea you had where you thought it was going to go and use that as the beginning to flesh out a story, right? To let it become the seed of your story forest. That's what I did, right? This idea of, well, what if this grandmother is smoking big smelly cigars for a really specific reason became part of the opening set of ideas that created The Last Witch. So now I want you to tell me what you think. Is it all right that I'm a thief? Should I be strung up in the town square? Can you think of some good movies or books that you think were really good at stealing, or maybe we're actually just really bad borrowers? Please put all those ideas and thoughts in the comments. And also remember, if you'd like to buy book 1 of The Last Witch, there's a link in the bio, and book 2 starts coming out on June 18th. Thanks so much, and happy stealing.